This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, or sign up for our email list to stay up to date on everything we have going on. And to get the most involved, join our free Mighty Networks community to get connected with others living this restorative justice life all over the world. As far as this podcast goes, make sure you're subscribed, leave a rating and review, and share with a friend to help us further amplify this work. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives. Oh, Dwanna, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
I am a Black woman and lead with those identities because they shape all the other things that I am.
Who are you?
I'm a mother to by the time this airs, she'll be 4-year-old little girl who is bright and bouncy and energetic, and is also teaching me on a daily basis what patience and love looks like in real time, what forgiveness looks like in real time, and really who is the reason that I am all the things that I am today.
Who are you?
I'm also a partner to an incredibly supportive man who gives me the space to let me dream my dreams. I'm a sister to my very best friend, a brother who has always had my back, and an auntie to a niece who really showed me how to mother, I think, in a way that was loving and supportive. My daughter is the beneficiary of all the things I tried out on my niece. So also thankful to be in the presence of a little girl who knows who she is, who firmly knows who she is at the age of 12.
Mm-hmm. Who are you?
I'm an introvert, which surprises some people. But so every time I talk to people, every time I sit in circle, it is a push because it does not come naturally for me. And though I have gotten many benefits from being in spaces and from being with people, I also am recognizing that I still need that time to recharge so I can be at my best.
Who are you?
I am an amateur cook. Love to cook, especially when I don't have to cook, so I don't have those opportunities as much anymore. But one of the happiest places that I'm in are in the grocery store and in my kitchen.
Mm-hmm. Who are you?
I am I'm an educator, but I'm also a lifelong learner, understanding that there's so much that I don't know, and always wanting to sit at the feet of folks who are wiser and know more so they can pour into me. And then also trying to create spaces where I can pour into others as well.
And finally, for now, who are you?
Well, I guess for the purposes of this conversation, I am the executive director of the Restorative Justice Partnership, and we work with schools and all the communities that surround and make up a school to implement whole school restorative justice. So while we do professional learning and training, I think our sweet spot is what comes after the training, where people really struggle to put what they learned into practice.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to get to all those intersections of who you are, diving deep right after this. Happy International Restorative Justice Week, everyone. I just want to take this opportunity to thank you so much for rocking with this podcast for as long as you have, whether today is your first episode or you've been with us for all 103. Because of your support of this podcast and Amplify RJ as an organization, I've been able to do restorative justice work and literally, quote unquote, amplify this work to thousands of people across the country and the world. I definitely don't take it for granted. And in some ways, we're just getting started. This conversation with Dwanna has been a long time coming. because she's someone that I met early on outside of my immediate mentors that really took the learning that she did while working for organizations and carved out a path for herself. So on so many levels, I'm grateful for the conversation and for her model. Over the past 2 years of doing this podcast, we've heard so many inspiring stories of people living this restorative justice life. So for this International Restorative Justice Week, we'd love for you to share something that you learned from this podcast with a friend, IRL, via text, or on the phone. Sharing on social media is great, and if you want to do that, you're more than welcome to. But as restorative justice practitioners, people who live this way of being, we know that interpersonal relationships are how this work really gets done. This podcast exists for many reasons, but one of the primary ones is allowing you to start conversations with people in your life who might not be thinking about things in a restorative framework all the time. So if there's something that stands out to you from this conversation with Dwanna or any of our past episodes, really want to invite you to take time this International Restorative Justice Week or in the coming week to strike up this conversation. So with all that being said, enjoy this conversation with Dwanna. Oh my goodness, Dwanna. This conversation has been a long time coming, like almost since like the beginning, probably the episode I did with Cheryl, which is the first episode of this podcast. She was like, "Oh, you should get Dwanna." Like, and here we are, 100 some odd episodes later. We made it happen. You're a busy person. I'm so glad that you were able to make the time. To the extent that you want to answer the question right now, how are you?
I'm okay. I had a lot of changes in my personal life over the summer. And so this has been a very busy fall. I think just kind of falling into a routine. My daughter started pre-K, big girl school. And so like, what does that look like? In this school year, I work with schools a lot. So this school year up until now has also been particularly busy. It feels like these last few months have been like 6 months. But everyone's fine. And so I feel like there's not really much I can complain about. So I'm good. I'm good. And like waiting for a break, waiting for December to come, really.
Yeah. A lot of resonance with like, changes in personal life as like new parent here on this end, like, and then like just going through the push of like the beginning of the school year, supporting, doing stuff, and then like now falling into a little bit of a routine, but like I'm learning the parenting doesn't stop. There's always a new thing, whether it is, you're mobile now and like you're trying to grab all of the phone chargers and eat them, to, oh, you can now like pull up and almost escape your crib. Let's like they're just like always constantly the things that you're navigating in new parent life. In addition to balancing this work that like we hold so dear. And we call the work restorative justice, but I imagine you've been doing the work longer than you've known those words. So in your own from your own perspective, how did this journey get started for you?
Yeah, so I didn't have like the easiest time in school myself. Had like some difficulties at home through periods of my life. And I was a good student, but also probably not a student who a lot of people pay like a whole lot of attention to. But I was very fortunate in high school in particular to have a number of people who really poured into me, who pushed me to use my voice, and who were forgiving when things weren't going well, who made space for me to grow, who showed me love and care and concern. And so when I started working in education, in the system of education, one of the things that I was surprised about was how often the right thing, like we know what the right thing is, how hard it is to do the right thing. And all the things that got in the way of doing what I believed were very simple, easy decisions. And so, I've worked both in and out of systems, but always found my way back to education, no matter what I was working on. And so at a certain point, I just accepted that this is what I'm doing. And I really found restorative justice through my work at Advancement Project, a civil rights organization, when I was tasked with really having conversations with stakeholders who typically, were not on the side of young people and families around the school to prison pipeline. And so informing people what that was, letting them know the harms of exclusionary discipline, and really working with them to kind of undo decades of policies and practices that had had this detrimental effect on the lives of Black and Brown young people and their families.
Yeah. When you were working at the advancement project was the time that, our paths intersected, where you were doing a lot of work, specifically helping to equip teachers, educators with these skills. But I want to like go rewind a little bit. You said that like your experience going through school wasn't like, oh, quote unquote troubled kid getting in trouble, being pushed out, etc. But you saw those things around you, and we think about like what is the quote unquote right thing to do, being something that like, if we think about it, if like folks stopped and thought about it, we're like, oh, this is just like the common sense thing. I'm going to bring in the name of Aura Shoup, whose t-shirt the t-shirt from her memorial I'm wearing. She often talked about, restorative justice is like what you would want for your children. Right. Sometimes in my, I wouldn't call it like spare time, but like as like motivation and research, I like go into teacher Facebook groups and like see like what people are saying when they're presenting problems and asking like the collective, like, oh, what is the thing to do? And, I'm remembering a post recently about, a disruptive student who is like constantly engaging in behavior that is disruptive to the class. Nothing like egregious as in like violence or things like that, but just like getting up, talking to people, and like after repeated times, like she was really fed up. And in the comments, right, there are all these people who are saying like, yeah, your admin's not supportive. I feel you. I'm so sorry. That kid needs XYZ thing. And then there's this one comment that was like, like, have you like had a conversation with that kid about, what's going on outside in their personal life? And I was like, and then like the original posters is like, I haven't. And I was like, why don't we start there? Right. And like the reasons that like the quote unquote right thing or the thing that would like benefit their relationship, like it is so hard to do those things. And, as we were talking about this conversation right before we started recording, we talked about, we have all of these quote unquote trainings that are really just like reminding us of how to be in right relationship with each other, taking the time to build, strengthen, and repair relationships when it occurred. And so this is a long way of asking the question: when you were a student, what were the things that you were seeing that were like, oh, why didn't that happen this way? Why didn't that happen this way? And like, what were the barriers that you identified to making those changes?
Yeah, so I'd say the people who I felt closest to in terms of my educators when I was in school were the ones who actually did those things, right? Mm-hmm. We noticed that you're off today. Like, what's going on? What's happening? Is there something happening at home? Is there something that you want to talk about? I remember when I was in the 10th grade, I was taking this class that typically only juniors took. And the first day of the class, the teacher says, there are two of us, two 10th graders in the class. She says, I don't know why they keep letting sophomores in this class. They never do well. Just like, you don't even know me. You don't know me. And I remember just feeling just not welcomed in her space. Like she did not want me there. She wouldn't call on me in class. Like even when she was going down the row and calling on everyone, she would skip me. And I remember going to my homeroom teacher from my ninth grade year. It happened to also be head of her department, and going to her and saying, like, I do not know what to do. I'm doing well in this class. I'm doing everything she's asking of me. I have no idea what I have done to this woman to make her feel this way. And this is a young person, like, feeling the weight of what did I do wrong, right? Mm-hmm. And not even thinking that, is there something more that she could have done? And I just remember that teacher saying to me, like, we're going to have a conversation with her together. I'm going to go with you to talk to her. We're going to get this settled. This is not acceptable. And so it was really seeing educators kind of step up and have my back when I needed something. And I think they only knew that because they had created the space for me to be able to go to them and talk to them. I, remember having another experience in my senior year of high school when I was going through so much at home, and I actually was not going to school. So I was habitually truant, in danger of being expelled actually from my school. And the principal, us having a meeting, and the principal stopping the meeting and looking at me and saying, Dwanna, everyone around this table loves you, right? And I don't know if I felt that. There were certainly people around that table who I did not think loved me. But in that moment, I knew that my school loved me and cared for me. And so I think I was the beneficiary of grace being shown to children. And so I knew what that looked like. And I think when I was in systems, the thing I couldn't figure out was, why weren't we extending that grace to all children? Like, school is a time for young people to learn and make mistakes and grow. And childlike behavior, behavior that is normal in young people, talking and socializing in school is normal for young people. Those things being criminalized instead of really trying to figure out what was wrong, what was going on, what was behind, what was happening, and really adults getting out of the way and not thinking everything was about them, right? Because young people have very full lives, like outside of the classroom.
When we talk about, like, do you know that your teachers or everyone in this room loves you? Like, I know that not all students feel that,
right?
In classrooms. Not all teachers feel that way about their students. Correct. And I'm gonna venture to say that that's like the minority of teachers, right? But there are a lot of teachers who like feel like they deeply care about their students, but aren't making the time to show that love, show that care, for any number of reasons, right? Like, I've witnessed conversations with teachers saying, like, well, don't they know that, like, I've got their best interest? Like, no, like what have you modeled that shows them that, like, you care about them as a person, not just like an assignment doer, a test taker, a subject to be managed. And like, while you're trying to create a quote unquote safe space for learning, right? How much of like what you're actually doing is just about order and quiet in that classroom setting. And so, of course, like, you as a human, if you like stopped and like were confronted with like a situation with a young person who was going through something, you would have the ability to step into empathy, right? Just as like you would want to do for your own child, a child that like you had a closer relationship, cared about. And I'm not saying that every teacher has to be like treating their kids like they were treating their students as if they were their own kids, in like a deep and intimate way. But this making the time to exhibit that care is so important. From things as simple as like check-in practices, not even necessarily circle, but knowing students' names, calling on students. I'm remembering this math teacher I worked with my very first time coaching, quote unquote, coaching restorative practices in a school. And he had this like really acute awareness that as a math teacher, right, a lot of students really didn't want to be in that space. And he made it his goal to have, like 2 positive interactions, versus to at least 2 positive interactions versus like corrections with each of his students, right? Not just like behavioral correction, but like correction like with instruction, right? Like, how are we like pouring more into these relationships? So like when it comes time for correction, like it's not just like, oh, Mr. So-and-so is just always on me, right? It's just like, oh, this person has exhibited care for me over the course of the school year, quarter, semester, whatever have you. Like, oh, I'm going to listen to them, right? It's in a lot of ways like the adage of people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. But like, what did you like as a child? as a student, like what did you see as barriers to that connection? And I know that there are many other barriers you've seen as an adult, but like, did you have an analysis of that as a young person?
Yeah, I don't know if it was. So again, I think I did fine in school, right? And so it really wasn't until I think teachers really started to take like an active interest in me. I will say from the first grade, I had an amazing first grade teacher who I really believed set the course of my education. She saw something in me, and like, I'm not knowing this at 6, right?
Mm-hmm.
But she saw something in me, saw potential, and pushed me that in a way that led to like every other experience that I had in school. And so I think from a very early age, I was shown like what could happen when like someone in the school building actually believes in you.
Mm-hmm.
And then, for the rest of elementary school, I think I was able to carry like what she did with me.
Mm-hmm.
Middle school is a blur.
Sure.
And then when I went to high school, I was especially in the school that I graduated from, which was a smaller school. So that's the other thing. I think we were able to connect with our teachers in a way that is not afforded always. And like, incredibly large classroom sizes. We had like kind of like a college schedule. So we didn't take the same class every day. And our classes were longer. And so you actually spent more time with teachers, and the teachers at this school, I also hear a lot of teachers, like, I know these children, I know them, I care about them. And it's very different to know someone's favorite ice cream flavor, or like, I noticed that your shoes are new today. It is something else when like I'm able to go to a teacher and say, kind of like, these are the things that are happening in my life, like outside of school, or you're going through a breakup and like a teacher pulls you to the side and says, this is not you. Like, let me tell you about this boy that you were dating and all the issues that he has. Like, who genuinely, I believe, loved you. And and I actually don't. I think that sometimes there's this assumption that because you go into education and you care about young people, you know how to build relationships with young people. And I just don't think that that's true. I don't think that everyone naturally knows how to build relationships. Relationships are something that we all have to work at. And the work is time consuming. But you have to believe in that part of it before you can get to the academics, right? And I think there's so many things that have happened just in the course of education where I think educators feel like they don't have the time to do those things. But in my experiences, the best experiences that I had in school were with the teachers who made the time. And those were classes where we weren't behind. It's not like we didn't learn. It's not like we weren't like achieving academically, whatever that means. We were smart, bright children who also had teachers who loved and cared about us in a very deep way to really know all the things that were going on with us as full human beings. I think that that's the thing. I was seen as a full human being and not just a name or a seat in a classroom.
So when you graduate, you start doing work like that is justice, equity focused, ending up like in education. You find the words restorative justice. What did it mean to you when you heard them the first time? And how has your understanding of the work of restorative justice, the life way of restorative justice, evolved?
Yeah. So unfortunately, when I heard about restorative justice, it was the alternative to suspensions and expulsions.
Yeah.
And that's such a gross, like inadequate definition of what it is. But this was a period of time when we started to see more attention paid to the school to prison pipeline. We started to see the unions at the national level, at least, really push back against zero tolerance policies, acknowledge like that decades of these policies were not having the effect that they wanted them to. And So the thing was, well, what do you do instead of suspend?
Mm-hmm.
And so restorative justice was the thing you did instead of suspend. And I say that, looking back now, like that's an inadequate definition is because like, that's just not the fullness of what like the work is, like really rooted in the idea that first we have to be in community with one another. And as a young person told me, you can't restore something that never existed. And so essentially, we were telling educators to, hold circles or whatever, whenever there's an issue, but we hadn't really talked about like all the work that needed to be done for young people to actually feel safe and supported in the classroom in general. And if they didn't really feel a connection with their classroom teacher, with other adults in the building, then why would they like participate in this process? And how in some cases like circles were also being used in a very punitive way, and then so they were seen as another form of punishment. Oh, okay, I'm not suspended, so I gotta sit through this thing, right? And what I've realized like over the course of time is that what we're really talking about is just being in relationship with one another. And then, as you say, like a lot of this stuff is very much like a common sense thing. I was in Hawaii recently and speaking to someone there where they also have, very similar like indigenous practices like circles. And one of the things that she said to me was, we go through all this professional development and training, and what it seems like it's taking us away from what we naturally know in our bodies, and that like we are supposed to be with one another, like we are supposed to be in community with one another. And I think that's absolutely right. Like all of the things that educators go through around rigor and academics and all that stuff is actually taking away from like the very natural process that we're actually now trying to get people to get back to in schools. And so that's kind of where we start now. And it's actually not about the kids because the young people are fine. The young people are responding to the environment that they're in, which is set by the adults. And so the work is actually adult work. We're trying to model what we want for our young people. And if we are not in a good relationship with one another as adults, then we can't then go into a classroom and say to children, to students, you need to work on your relationships when we are not even in proper relationship with one another. And so, I've evolved away from the just restorative justice as a response to harm and even restorative justice about children, and really focus on like what staff need to do to build relationships with one another.
I too am in a similar place. And, the thing that I'm like currently wrestling with is I am long-term optimistic about the changes that can be made. But as public education is currently constructed, can restorative justice be at the center as a value of the way that a school operates? I'm going to make the statement that it can't, right? As restorative justice is currently constructed. So if it can't, then what is the thing that we're actually asking educators to do? And like you can push back on like that it can't part, but if you are asking educators to be a certain way in a system that is not built for them to be a certain way, what is it that we're actually asking them to do?
We're asking them to push up against the system. And so I think so I agree with you. I share the same feelings about systems. Mm-hmm. And so while I sometimes work with systems, I actually concentrate on a community because I do not trust the systems to do the things, to do the right thing, right? To do the thing that is necessary for restorative justice to actually take hold system-wide. I also believe that at an individual school level, administrators have a lot of power, and that sometimes the system isn't always paying attention to what you're doing. And so if you have a building leader that believes in the work, I have seen building leaders, and sometimes we're taking things away from teachers. Like we're not going to allow them to do this thing. We're going to cause them to be reflective with their actions. We're going to ask, a number of questions. We're going to push them in ways that they haven't been pushed before. We're going to, have them actually explore who they are in their own education and how that is showing up, like when they teach their children. I think especially when, you have our public school population of young people is majority students of color, and our teaching population is like 83% white, right? Like, so what are the assumptions that you have, right, as how you grew up, your education, and like, are you putting those assumptions on like other people? Like, and so people needing to explore that, but the justice part of restorative justice to me is also thinking about then what do we need to actually transform this space? Mm-hmm. And what I say to educators all the time is that the work is not about how to fit restorative justice in this broken system, or I'm sorry, the system's not broken, right? It's doing what it was designed to do into this, I won't curse, messed up system. But really, how do we actually transform the system? The system needs to change. And we can't wait on the system to change. The system isn't going to save us. So in our own individual community, what do we need to push up against? What are the practices that we need to let go of? What are the policies that we no longer need to hold? If there is a system policy that is influencing what we're doing, like what are the conversations that we're having with central office or whomever around like how this isn't working? And I think, again, holding that central office systems don't necessarily pay attention to everything that the school is doing on a day-to-day basis. And so you need leaders who are brave and bold and who are willing to make those changes. And I think at an individual school level, if you have that, then you can institutionalize a lot of things and leaders change, which I think is why it's really important, the involvement of the surrounding community, families and young people in this work, that it actually can't be owned by the people who teach in the building, but it really has to be something that the community drives.
So you just said like a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful thing about like school leadership and like how they change. And then you drop that and like every 3 to 5 years, right, leadership turns over, right? And so like where I get stuck and like where I'll say lose hope. I don't think that's fully accurate. Where I am critical and wary is like, all right, so like we're going to put in a bunch of work with a school leadership team that is bought into this. And for the next, 2 to 3 years, things are going to incrementally shift at schools because, in my experience, right, this is not an overnight change process, right? There is not a school that I've experienced that is saying like, we're going to stop everything for like 3 or 4 weeks to just work with our staff on revamping everything in all of our approaches. And we're going to continue to dedicate time weekly, daily to like making sure that we are in alignment with the values of restorative justice. I haven't seen a school that's done that. And so if anybody's listening has a school that like has made a drastic change like that and stuck to it in like a month's time, holla, because I want to interview them here on this podcast. Schools have lots of different competing priorities, right? And when schools have a bunch of competing priorities, the change happens slower. That's just true. Like when I'm talking to school leaders, I'm sure when you're talking to school leaders, you're talking about like, all right, so what is the time that you're going to dedicate? Not like we talk about financial resources and that's important, but I think what's so much more important is what is the time that you're going to dedicate to allow people to continue to learn, but not just like learn the information, but like to practice, mess up and like continue to grow in community and like be supported in that growth. You have to take time away from other things because, there are only a certain number of hours in a day. And when that time isn't as abundant as we would like, it's just going to take longer. So there's this 2 to 3 year, like 1, 2, 3 year change process that, a school goes through, implements some practices, and then school leadership changes. New school leadership may or may not be like fully aligned. Budget above an individual school might change. And so like, that's why like with schools as currently constructed, I'm like very skeptical, wary of like the way that this is implemented well. You brought in this layer of like, okay, parents and community actually, caregivers and other stakeholders like owning this work and like demanding that this be a part of how things are done at the school, as this is the culture of the school. Where have you seen that work well?
Yeah, so I will say that there have been additional resources,
Yeah.
but I have been lucky over like the last like handful of years, 5 years or so, to have to had the opportunity to kind of work alongside an administrator who fundamentally believed in the work and believed that this work needed to drive all other work. And so if that was dedicating entire staff meetings for learning, if that was taking away the ability for staff to write office referrals, like who I think also knew that it was a process that we weren't going to get everyone. We weren't ever going to get everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And that we would, identify like the people as we were growing and building and learning who were ready to kind of move with us. And as a leader who also believed that, she also didn't know like everything, right? And so was also in a space of like constant learning. And so, I mean, the approach that we often take is like the principal has to want to do it, that it can't be a mandate. It can't be like, we want RJ everywhere in every school. Like the principal has to actually ask for it and say, like, I want to do it. And then we got to explore like the reasons why, like, what is the vision that we're working on? Because sometimes people say they want to do things and they really don't want to do them. But like, if you want to do this work, it's hard. This is what it means. It's like a completely another job, like, and running a school. And I think that your question around like involving families, the community, young people, this is a thing that schools struggle with. In my experience, even when we've been intentional about knowing your community, involving your community, this work can't be done without the community. And we've trained young people, we've trained families, in circle keeping. We've, had them as part of professional learning. The school itself, or the individuals in the school, like, still struggle with maintaining those relationships. It is just not a thing that schools do well. They do not do family engagement well. And so that is hard, right? Because like the work itself is hard, and it's like, but this is part of the work. Like, you can't say I'm implementing restorative justice and never talk to families. Yeah. You can't say I'm implementing restorative justice and just working with the staff and never allowing families to kind of come in. You can't say I'm implementing restorative justice and not doing more to make your space inviting to families, or going to families because they don't want to come into the school building because of past harms. And I think that is the work for me, like this year, that I'm really trying to lean into. Like, we still have to focus on staff because staff is always growing, never changing. But like, we also have to be intentional about the work that we do with families. And that could be our goal for the year. And if I'm not doing my job of like checking in on like a regular basis with where things are, I know it is the first thing that will drop, because it will always be the first thing dropped.
And like, as executive director of like Restorative Justice Partnership, right? Like the work, quote unquote, ownership of restorative justice work at XYZ school can't and shouldn't begin and end with you.
Right.
Right. And so and that's where I'm like, yeah, this isn't going to work. And so like, I like on my less optimistic days, on my less hopeful days, I'm like, harm reduction. Like, we're equipping adults in the building to be in relationship in a different way with each other and with students. And that has a positive effect. But when it comes to like changing the system, right? Like, I haven't seen a sustained effort at a public school. I'll say a public school, because I can think of like very small independent schools who like are dedicated to this. Folks can check out the episode I did with Stephanie Sarantos, talking a little bit about what that structure at their Sudbury Model School looks like. But I get to this point of harm reduction, and yet, yes, that's helpful. And like, in the big scheme of things, what is it that we're actually doing? I'm curious, before you were executive director of Restorative Justice Partnerships, you did work with the Advancement Project, right? And like we're working nationally. What were some of the things that you saw work well? I think I'd rather highlight the things that went well versus like the things that went wrong for lots of people, because like we can imagine lots of the things that like didn't like go as well. So if there are any things that like are particularly egregious or you think that would be helpful for people to hear, like you can highlight those. But like what went well, what worked, what was a common pattern among schools or school leaders that really helped this work like take root to some extent.
Yeah, so I think it was at Advancement Project where I think we tested things, right?
Yeah.
We collectively had me and some of the trainers who I was working with like had ideas around like what school could be, like what could be possible. We weren't necessarily seeing it everywhere, so bits and pieces. And so, I think, having like an administrator who really believed like, we're never going to we're not going to send children home, and really holding that belief, right? And I know that and that's of course, tying restorative justice to discipline. However, I think it is important. It is an important belief to say we are not going to send young people home. Because what that also means is that you have to figure it out. I saw staff ask that question: what happens when you tried 10 things and the student still isn't behaving? I'm using air quotes because people can't see me because I do not believe in that. But and the response was, well, it just means we haven't figured it out yet and we have to keep trying, right? And so I saw staff that was invested in the child. I saw staff that was committed. You spoke at the beginning around like, what can we do to just make people feel welcome? And, this is not a good thing, but like there are some schools where I've been in when if the principal just said something like, stand outside your door and greet all young people, it's met with moans and eye rolls. Like it's a hardship to say good morning to like a student. And I was in schools where the staff were like, I'm going to learn every student's name in this entire school, right? And so I was fortunate there were a lot of hard conversations, right? There were a lot of days where, I'm in tears crying because of things that I've heard. But I was also really fortunate to learn from people who were trying things, who were going into the community, meeting people who were saying, we hold our PTA meetings or not PTA, but like parent teacher conferences at, midnight, because we know in our community, people work second shift and we will never get families in at 6. We will never get it. And so we know our community, so we're going to adapt to our community. Principals who are like, we're going to go into the neighborhood and hold parent-teacher conferences there because it's easier to just park ourselves in an apartment complex and have families come to us instead of asking them to come to a school. And so I took little pieces that, like I would hear like innovative things. Again, that wasn't my own experience when I was at school and didn't seem to be the experience that like most schools were doing, and just kept stock of those. And they really informed like kind of the work that I do now, because then it became, okay, so if we have like all these ideas around what people have done, what if we just start from a place where we need the leadership on board? And then what that means, we're going to make you talk about race and racism. We're going to have those conversations when you say and do something that is not kind to a child or to your colleague. I'm going to do more than just like think, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're talking to that person like that, but I'm actually going to interrupt harm when I see it happen. And I'm going to do it on an individual level. And then I'm going to use that as an example of how we have to talk to the rest of the staff around this thing that happened. And so, but that's true commitment. And I think that's why I think finding the leaders who you really do have to, I don't want to say you can't care, but you can't be focused on the things that the system tells you that are the most important things. Because the system, while they will communicate that relationships are important, there's nothing about the system that actually shows that. And so you really have to be the type of leader who is saying, I'm just going to do what I think is in the best interest of children. And what someone rightly pointed out to me the other day is that you also have to explore what is the best interest of children, because there are people who believe they're doing the best thing for children that are harming children. And so I know you said earlier, like, we're not necessarily asking educators to love children as they love their own child, but I think that's what I'm asking. I want to send my child to school and I want her to feel the same love she feels at home. And I think that a little deeper level, what that means is that the values that we have at home in terms of being inquisitive and curious and learning and asking questions, which are very much punished sometimes in school, especially when it comes to little Black girls. I want that teacher to look at my daughter and love her as if they were teaching their own daughter. And I know teachers who are like, I love all the children like I love my own, because I'm sending my child into someone else's classroom and I want them to be cared for in the same way. And, that doesn't mean you have to give hugs or whatever, but like the way I see my daughter and all that she is, right? I think that, families are not, they see their children fully. Right. So I know I'm going to get calls about my daughter being chatty, and I know I'm going to get calls about my daughter asking questions. But when I get those calls, I want them to come from a place of love and understanding. My daughter, before she was in school, she was in daycare, all day daycare. And I remember our first message. I was talking to my friend. I was like, oh, we got our first message. Something's happened. And they're like, Bailey didn't sleep. She didn't take a nap today. And when we asked her why wasn't she sleeping, she says, well, because I'm a big girl and I don't need naps. And they were like, we thought that was so funny. And we're just calling to let you know that she might be tired later. So it wasn't your child is being defiant or who does she think she's grown, air quotes, right? It was just that she's funny. And we're just telling you because she may be sleepy later. And that's the type of love, right? My daughter, that is how she is. And that is the type of experience that I want every parent, every family member to have with their child. My partner says a lot that, families are sending schools the absolute best that they have. Like, my child is the best of me. And what are we doing with that best? The best that they've got, like, how are we treating that, right? And I think that is such an important question to hold on to. Like, are we stripping the dignity of little children? Are we making schools like not fun or not a place that little children want to be, because we're not loving them like fully as they should be loved?
Yeah, and I want to differentiate. I don't expect somebody to like care for my kid the way that I care for them, but like this collective care for children and this collective love for children and like acknowledgement of interconnection, what is good for me, when I do harm to you, I'm harming myself. When I am loving and supporting you, I'm loving and supporting myself, is like the ethic of care that we want all adults, not just teachers, to have in the world. We often reference the quote unquote 7 core assumptions of restorative justice that Carolyn Boyce Watson and Kay Prance developed in Circle Forward and The Heart of Hope, I believe. And they talk about, everyone has a need to be in a good relationship, right? It doesn't say like everyone needs to be in like great relationship with everyone at all times. And there are different people who have different capacities to connect with different people based off of lots of things, personality, primarily, right? But like this collective care, this ethic of care for young people who are coming into your space is really important. What that can't look like, right? You mentioned like the principal who's like, okay, you have to stand outside your room and greet everyone. Like it can't be limited to like just the behavior, right?
Right.
Because like someone standing outside and greeting children doesn't mean that they have that ethic of
Right.
care, right? Someone sitting down in a circle passing a talking piece doesn't mean that that person has the heart, the life way of like holding space for people. Just because someone has restorative questions of what happened, who was impacted and how do we make things right or as right as possible instead of what rule is broken, who did it, and what punishment did they deserve. Like just because someone has like those behaviors doesn't mean that they're being this way. And I wrestle with this often, and I'm curious how you're thinking about it, right? We're asking people not just to change their behavior, but like change in a lot of ways, like who they are, like fundamentally, their orientation towards the world. I don't like, and I don't know that like that is something that we can expect in systems that are currently constructed, where like, shout out to teachers, right? Where people are like doing way more work than they probably signed up for way less money than they thought they were going to be compensated. And, we talk about, students being people who are marginalized and oppressed. Like teaching as a profession, education as a profession is often on those margins as well, right? You talked about, how you got the phone call home, like, Bailey did this funny thing today. Like that's beautiful. Like it's not that she's in trouble. Like how much are school leaders, school administrators pouring into their staff that same way? Not just like, oh, I didn't see you outside of your classroom waving to kids. Oh, I didn't get your grade reported. Like, oh, I didn't see these lesson plans. Like what are the ways that like school leaders are actively pouring in, building relational equity so teachers are then more incentivized? And so like you can give people like the the information, you can give people the skills, and like if the situation, the conditions, the school building is not conducive to like those things, like how are we expecting people to actually make these changes in conditions that are not like, and like that seems super pessimistic, but like I'm asking you like at this point of curiosity, because to me, like again, at the end of the day, on my worst days, it's like harm reduction.
Right.
On my more hopeful days, it's like, oh no, we can change. Like how do you like wrestle with all of that? Because I know that these are thoughts that you've had.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a constant wrestling of, am I making a difference?
Sure.
I think, am I part of the problem? And by working with systems, am I actually
Mhm.
part of the problem? And so I think the approach of starting with staff, right? And so before we ask, so, we get this question a lot, well, there's no time to do anything else.
Mhm.
I agree. Um, and I think, our answer is like, we're not asking you to do anything. We are asking you to be possibly
Mhm.
something else. We are asking you to be more reflective about your own thoughts and feelings. It is not my belief that everyone should be keeping a circle, right? It's not everyone should be trained in circle keeping. I think everyone, if a building leader, if this is work that they want to do, then I do think it's a responsibility for everyone to know what it is, to give everyone the opportunity to learn about it. But whether or not people want to absorb that information is also like their right. But I think when the focus on staff first, and I think, in a lot of schools, it is about the children because the children are easier.
Mhm.
um, as hard as sometimes it can be, their children are easier than the adults, right? Because now what you are asking is for someone who's had sometimes a very full life to like reflect on their own practices, their past, their present, and have I been in situations where I have caused more harm than
Yeah.
I've created? And I think like, so our approach is really identifying a leader who, and again, it can't just be, hey, here's me, I'm raising my hand, I want to do this work. It really has to be, you understand the commitment, you understand what is necessary, and and you communicate that it's a long road, and you have a vision for where you want your school to be. And I think that that's the hope part. There's a vision that we're working toward. We're not going to get there tomorrow or even next year, but there is a vision that we're walking this path together and we're going to get there. And if you start with the adults, and you identify there are going to be adults in the building who are like, this is what I've been waiting for. This, like being able to actually stop my class sometimes, being able to actually have conversations with students, being able to know my colleagues. This is why I came into teaching. You're going to have some of those staff members and you want to grab them immediately, right? All the training, all the things, send them to everything so they can learn more. You're going to have some people in the middle who are, I don't know what this is. Mm-hmm. What is this thing they're asking us to do? Things come and go in education all the time. How long is this going to be around? They're not resistant. They're just waiting it out, right? But the more they see their friends and colleagues kind of engaging in behavior or showing up to school happy, or the culture of the building starts to change, like you walk into the building and people are talking to you, they're talking to you as an adult and smiling and asking you how your day was, how your evening was, what you did over the weekend, asking you about your own family. The culture changes, starts to change. You see bits and pieces, and then those people in the middle may get on board, right? Because they're like, okay, like I get it. Like I see it in practice. I just needed to see it. And there are going to be some staff members who just may be tired, right? Like maybe they can't do it, right? There may be some that don't want to do it, and maybe some really just can't, because, self-reflection is hard work. It's not easy really to hold that mirror to yourself and really ask those tough questions and be reflective with all of your thoughts. And for some folks, they're just not in a space, or maybe they're not in the right space to be able to do that. And what I've seen eventually is sometimes, they were resistant, but as the culture shifts, you can still resist, but you're quietly resisting because now you're an outlier. Or sometimes they find a space that is, more in line with their own values, right? Mm-hmm. Because, the values of the community have shifted to something else. Or sometimes they just, kind of push through. Sometimes they come around, right? They're like, I want to be a part of this too. But you really do need someone who I think, has those beliefs that it's not just that you're doing this thing. Because I think there are a lot of things done in school that are very surface level that don't really evoke the type of relationship building that we're talking about, that we want people to have. And I think that for adults, I think, Cheryl always used to say that, people need to experience it themselves before we ask them to do it for someone else. And so I do think like part of the work of a building leader is really about what spaces are you creating for your staff? How are you modeling self-reflection for your staff? How are you modeling, I messed up, and admitting your mistakes to your staff? Like, how are you building community with your staff? Are you allowing your staff to take time away from the day and be in relationship with one another? The same thing we want for young people, because the work really does have to start there. And I think when it's done that way, there's a possibility. But I'm speaking like in an individual school community, because I do think that then there's that next layer of how the system sometimes gets in the way. And so again, one of the reasons why this work is so difficult is because the system is not built for this work. And so we have to, in some ways, create these little mini systems inside schools that are operating differently.
There are two things. One is like, the second one's escaping me, so we're just going to go with one. You talked at I remember what the second part was, and it's kind of related. You talked about, the commitment that a school leader has to make, and we've talked around it, but how would you quantify what that commitment is? Like you talked about, being able to model that kind of self-reflection. We've talked about like needing to commit time. We've also talked about committing to losing people, both families and staff, who are not in line with values. What are the other things that school leaders need to commit to? Because like my hope is, right, like there are people who are listening to this podcast, right, who are either teachers, parents, community stakeholders, maybe even school leaders who like, hey, if I really want my community, my school community, or my child's school community to be about this, like this is what it costs, and we need to know that. How would you quantify the commitment that a school leader needs to make?
Yeah, I'd say the first is you have to be able to look at yourself, right? And I mean, you can't ask anyone to do something that you are not willing to do yourself. And so any type of self-reflection, any type of like exploration about, your own experiences with education, those are the things that you have to explore. You have to, I think, be willing to push up against the system. Like you have to be willing to say, if someone comes into this building and they're doing some evaluation and they walk through and, people are sitting in circle and not looking at the chalkboard, that you're going to back up the staff, right? Mm-hmm. And that you're not going to fold. I think administrators have to have a vision, right? So when I say like, I think I stay in a hopeful space oftentimes because I am working towards a thing. I'm helping someone work towards a thing. And so it's not enough to say, I want my school to be like a restorative justice school, right? You have to, what does that mean to you? Like as a building leader, like, what does that actually look like? What does that sound like? It's one of the very first questions that we ask administrators, like, telling me you want to implement restorative justice is not really saying anything. Like, what does this actually mean? And I think it is hard for some people to think about what school could be because school's only been one way. And so I think this is where the dreaming part comes in. Like, there are dreams that we're able to make reality, but we have to actually be willing to dream. And so a dreamer, really, right, who's willing to adjust schedules, to adjust workloads, to, adjust meeting times to be able to make the space. Like if there's an issue and we need to come together and talk about it, like, you're willing to devote the hours sometimes that is necessary in the day to be able to do that. And that may mean subs, right? And so, but I think you have to be willing to talk about race and racism. Like you cannot do this work and not be honest about those things, right? You have to be able to be willing to listen and center the experiences of those who are most pushed to the margin. So whoever that is in your community, when you close your eyes and think about what you're doing, and if school is working, school needs to work for those folks. If that's your staff, because, as you were saying, there are staff who are pushed to the margins as well. If that's your students, if that's your families, and you need to hold them, because if school is working well for them, it'll work well for everyone else. Like we know that, like research mm-hmm. says that. And so, but if you can't talk to your staff about race and racism and all the other isms and the role that they play in education, then you can't do this work, right? Because you're not doing the work fully. And I think it is a lot. That's a lot to ask. And I think where systems kind of make the mistake is that the expectation that everyone is ready to do it, and they're not, right? And so I think you can get people ready. But the same thing for systems. If you start with the administrators who are ready, who have done that work, and start with them, then the hope is, and sometimes what I've seen is that other principals start to pay attention. This school was a different school 6 years ago. What happened in the course of time where now you have people wanting to be in the school? Like you want staff who were leaving the school now want to be in that school. Like what has happened? And I think you also have to value something more than test scores. Because this is my own personal, thinking. Like test scores are such an arbitrary way to measure anything. And so if you are driven by performance data, and so you're worried that because you're stopping, like the test scores are going to go down, like you really can't be focused on those things. And I think part of it is also you have to be willing to listen to what the community wants and what the community needs, and listen to young people. They will tell you what school should be and how it should be, and, holding families in a good way. And so if you're not someone who believes in sharing power with other people, especially people who are younger than you, then this work can also be challenging, because it really is acknowledging that the wisdom really resides within the people who you're serving.
I'm thinking yes to all of the above. I'm thinking about, being true to these values in the face of, those who have power over you, whether that is people from the district or if you're in an independent or charter school situation. board members or parents, right, who say, I wanted my kid to come here for test scores, right, to get ahead in these ways, right? Those are the hard things. I do a lot of the work Amplify RJ does is with independent schools and charter schools, just because there is more agility, more flexibility in the way that we work. And oftentimes what I hear from school leaders is we are wanting to make these shifts and using their language, right? The entitled parents, right, who paid XYZ for their parents, for their kids to have like this kind of quality, top-notch, high performance, whatever education, like aren't on board. And you think about who those parents are demographically, parents who are affluent, right? Parents who are white, parents who are trying to help their kids climb the same ladders that they climbed, get the test scores, go to the same schools that require those things. And as a school leader who wants to do this work in the face of that kind of opposition, you've got to really value that and be willing to lose the support, lose the tuition, lose the endowment money that like comes with that. And that's a really hard thing. And like every context has different barriers. And as you were saying, like as you were listing, like all of those commitments, like the manifestation of that is going to look different in every situation. But like this is not like oh yeah, we're going to do this peer conferencing program so the students can work out their like bullying issue, right? Like this is like the underlying way that your school functions. How does restorative justice partnerships work with schools in supporting this kind of growth?
Yeah. And so we help with a lot of those things.
Yeah.
I think, we start with an administrator's vision, and then, really then our role is to assist in implementing that vision. And to your point, it is not going to be the same thing everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. Because every vision is different. I think when it comes to those questions around like folks who are entitled or that's also part of the conversation that you're having with the community, right? This is a community, right? And I think that moving away from that, like my individual needs and goals for my child, and should those be above like what is actually happening to other children, like in real time in this community? If I feel like I'm a part of this community, then what does that actually mean? And so it is sometimes, this was a lot of the conversation when, we've started conversations around like discipline and, push out. There could be families who are like, no, I want that child gone. And the work is really like, how do we like have that conversation with the family in a way where it's, how do we hold all children like equally in the same way and not prioritize one over the other? And so I think this is part of the work of the community. And so we, starting with that vision, then it really is like, what are the things, where is your staff? Like, what does your staff need? What do we need to put in place? I think keeping the focus on the staff, right? Because it's very easy to, staff will want to do things with like the young people and like, nope, the focus is still on staff. We are trying to shift the culture and climate of the school building. And research shows that the culture and climate of the school building is built by the adults, right? The young people are responding to the environment that they are in. And so it's constant work, right? Because I think that when things are stressful, when the year goes on, like this point of the year, when people are feeling like all the stress, it is very easy to revert back to what you have always done. And so I think this work is also incredibly precious, right? You can put in years of work and it could be undone in no time, right? And it's that constant support. I think, when we think about professional development, a lot of professional development that educators typically get is very much a sit and get. We're going to talk to you this one time for 2 hours, and then we're not going to see you ever again. And sometimes we're going to talk to you for 2 hours, and then we want you to teach someone else. Like, this isn't that, right? It is ongoing professional development. And even for the staff who are all the way in the very beginning, they also still need ongoing professional development. It's the care and concern that we must hold for each other in this space? Are there opportunities for me to, as a team member, as a staff member, to come into this space and really talk about my life outside of like work? We ask our administrators to kind of put together like a yearly implementation plan so they can monitor like what their goals were for the year, and tell them that that plan should change, because what you thought you were going to do in August is not the thing that you actually should be doing in February. Like, you are learning as you're going, but if you don't have a plan to start the year, this was kind of like one of my first schools that I worked with did not have a plan and something happened. Something happened in the personal lives of one of the administrators, and we didn't have anything written down. And so it was like, oh, where's the work going? What's happening with the work? And just how important having something on paper that people can follow, and then communicating that to staff. This is where we want to go. This is what we want to do. This is what we've done. Celebrating small victories, right? So staff feels like they're a part of the work and are informed along the journey, because the journey is long. And if you say we're going to implement restorative justice and then staff don't really hear about it for another year, they think that it's not there anymore, right? And so like the constant kind of reminders, but it is very individualized because each community is different. Each community has different needs. What are the needs of this community? What are the vision of the people in this community? How are we capturing that? And then we base the work that we do then on those things.
Yeah. We like dumped a lot. Like there was a lot of information, right? And a lot to do, and like it's a tall task. And like I don't want to leave people in this place of feeling like, oh my gosh, this is so overwhelming. How will we do any of it? Right. You know, the proverb of like, how do you eat an elephant? Right. One bite at a time, right, is so important. And like, you've got to decide that like, no, we're going to eat this elephant.
Right.
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 And, you know, if you as a school leader or somebody who's working in a school, or a parent of a child who's in a school, or, you know, concerned community member of a community that has a school, like, you know, wherever you live, there's a school within a mile of you, right? Are hearing this and saying like, oh, like this would be beneficial. Like, what is your message of hope and encouragement to someone who just, you're like, oh, there's so many things. But yeah, we can do this. What's your message of hope and encouragement?
Yeah, it's possible. And I think that when we think about time, I mean, that seems to be like the most precious resource, right? Mm-hmm. The time is there. I think it's how are we using the time? So if you are, you know, if you're a classroom teacher and you're spending your classroom period telling young people to sit down and not talk and be still, like the time is being spent. Like, what would that look like if you're asking young people when they first arrived, what is it that you need today? And I think that there's so much information and data and that shows that if we focus on like the well-being of people, we actually get to all the results that we are supposed to get to. And school systems say that, and then in practice, that's actually not what happens. I think we have to hold on to this idea that the time is there. We're not getting any extra time. So it's how are we making use of our time? And that it is a slow process. But I think if you know it's a slow process, then you're okay with it, because there are beautiful things that happen along the way. And I think that that's really the celebrating the small wins, right? Making sure you're actually taking the time to do that, because there's so much growth that happens. And when you look back, like I've seen schools like transform, and, you know, the staff think, you know, we can't even imagine that the school used to be something else. We can't even imagine going back there. And if you're a staff person thinking about like what it feels like to walk into a building, what it feels like to want to go to work every day, to want to walk into that building and be there every day. If you're like a family member, like the pride that you have in sending your child to that school every day. If you're a student and you're thinking about you're going into a school building where you want to be, right? Because you're cared for. you know, it can happen. It can happen. But there is like a level of commitment that is necessary, like all good things in life, right? Like, I want a loving family and a good relationship. And I think thinking about your own personal relationships, they're also work. Like, they're not easy. They don't come naturally. I want my child to feel loved and supported, and I have to work on myself every day to make sure I'm showing up as a good mother. I want my partner to feel loved and supported, and I have to work every day to make sure I'm showing up in a good way. Like, and I know what the benefits of that will be. And it's work that I'm committed to because I care so much, and I want this to happen. And so this is my dream. This is what I want. And so I know I have to work for it. And I think the work of implementing restorative justice is no different, right? You put in the work and you reap like all the amazing benefits. And it is possible. Not if people do not want to do it. And I think that's where sometimes the issues lie, is that I don't know if some people are, I think, being told that they have to, right? And then it becomes like a very much a checkbox. And people find the way, if this is something that they want to do, they have managed to find a way to make things a reality.
I think like there's a way that can be interpreted where it's like personal responsibility for implementing this work. And like on some level, that's true. And like a personal responsibility message, but like can be a barrier for some people because like, yeah, but like this systemic thing actually prevents me from doing that. And if it's important enough to you, you're gonna find a way to do it. Maybe not like get it perfectly and like do everything, but like what are the step one you can take, right? One bite at a time. What is the vision that you have? How can you share that vision? Who are the people in your community who are aligned with you on that? And like, how can you make steps together? So much good. Anything else that you want to share with folks before I transition into the questions that everybody answers when they come on the podcast?
No, I mean, I appreciate the conversation and the questions about hope. Miriam Kaba, is like a famous quote, like hope is a discipline. Mm-hmm. It is also something that I work on. I don't think I think I at one point in my life was like a natural optimist. I think I'm more of a realist at this point. But I do believe you do have to believe that schools can be different, not just better, but different. And there are enough people who work in systems who believe that schools need to be different. I think, how do we identify those folks? How do we support those folks? Because I think sometimes those folks feel like they're the only one. And there are lots of them out there, right? And so like, how do you identify those people so it doesn't become like this thing that you're doing all by yourself, that you're also building a community of people around you. I know I wouldn't be able to do this work if I didn't have a community of people who were around me, who were nurturing me, who were telling me that I could do it, who believed in the work, who were encouraging me on the hard days, who were like picking me up. We can't do this work alone. And so I also would encourage everyone out there to also think about like who in your community may also be in line with this work. Who can you partner with? Who can you work with? Like when you have conversations with your friends, how is school talked about? Like, do people see like that a change is necessary? And I think there's so many examples in the history of our country of change happening, and that change was typically led by families and young people. And so the message is really to them around like, if you want schools to be better, different, and you actually hold that power to change, you're really the only people who've always held that power. Like no system has ever changed because it was the right thing to do. They were forced to change. And so I think that's just, for me, it's always like a good memory that there are so many examples of change, like, and really, I think, change by like Black and brown communities, right, too. And we just need to lean into that.
I'm trying to debate whether it's worth getting in trouble for saying this, but when you're talking about change being demanded by people of marginalized identities, yes, that's true. And that change, some of that change is like self-determined, but on a systemic levels, right? That change is made by people in power, often white people, right?
Mhm.
Who are like, it's inconvenient to not make this change, so we're going to do it. So a challenge to white folks, right? Like if you're in this position of power, don't wait don't wait till it comes to that, right? We
Right.
can make those changes. Oh
Right.
man. Yeah, we'll leave that in. I think that was I believe everything that I said. Come and get me, haters. As we've heard, so much about doing this work is the practice, but it's always great to have some fundamentals. So if you want to tap into the Intro to RJ, Racial and Restorative Justice course, the link to engage in that learning is in the show notes. If you want to go deeper in your practice or explore other aspects of doing work that is restorative and building a better world for future generations, we have learning opportunities for you too, both in courses and live workshops. If you're in a community, school, or organization that would benefit from this learning, we're more than happy to get on a call with you to talk about how we can support this work in your context. In addition to rating, reviewing, and subscribing to this podcast, amplification of this work also means sharing these learning opportunities with others. So if there are individuals in your life who you want to really know this work in a deep and meaningful way, and you've found the things that you've heard here on this podcast really relevant, please send them our way. It's how we literally amplify the work. Now back to the questions that everybody answers when they come on these airwaves. We've talked around it in so many different ways, but in your own words, define restorative justice.
So restorative justice is an indigenous philosophy that emphasizes building relationships. It is the ability to recognize the inherent wisdom that exists in all members of our community when there is harm to the community. And this isn't the absence of harm, because whenever human beings are involved, there will be harm, often unintentional. Restorative justice actually allows us to come together and repair that harm as a community, not relying on others to repair things for us, but we have everything that we need within our community.
Mm. You've been doing this work for a minute. What has been an oh shit moment, and what did you learn from it?
There have been lots. So I could curse. Okay, I forgot about that. Yeah. I think probably the moments that are sticking with me the most are when I was asked to do something, a training is this long, and it's like, oh, can you fit it into this shorter amount of time? And I know in my heart that is never the thing to do. And I know that because I've done it and it was a disaster. And so I think that, having like a set of kind of non-negotiable values, every time I've strayed away from those is when I have gotten into trouble. And so I use those as lessons. It's just a lesson that, we often know what to do, and how I also have to not be lured into kind of, again, trying to fit restorative justice into something, and instead saying, if this is the work that you want to do, then how do we adapt what you're doing to fit this?
Yeah. That resonates so hard. I'm not going to tell the story. I'll tell that story off air. No, it's worth it. What you learn from that, right? And what I've learned from similar situations is you articulate that boundary, right? This is what I will do. And so I'm leaving specifics out, right? But I cannot do the training the way that you're asking me to do this. Right. This is what I can do. This is why. And if people aren't willing to conform to that, they weren't ready for the work with you at that time. Right. And that's okay. As much as I would have loved that XX thousands of dollar check, right? And that's the thing, right? And this is a conversation, as we've been having this conversation, the wheels are turning about the business of doing restorative justice work is another conversation that needs to be had. I don't know if it's the form of like this podcast, but like I'm thinking about lots of different people who I'm in relationship with over the years, both through this podcast and just, this is actually like a hundreds of people, small community. We're not always in line with each other on like how we're doing these things. And that's a whole nother conversation for a whole different time.
I learned from Cheryl and Aura that not all money is good money.
Mm-hmm.
And they were, I think, the first examples of like people who I met who said no they just said no. They said no to a lot of things because it didn't feel right, because it wasn't right, because it wasn't aligned with their own values, the way that they did the work. And it was such an important lesson for me to learn very early, to witness people who are, hold in such high regard, like walk away from things because it was just like, this is no longer in line with the way we do work. And there was years ago, like a group of us kind of got together collectively and we're like, what are our collective values that we're going to hold as like the smaller community of practitioners in a larger community? And it has been that has been so helpful for me, because I always go back to that. And when I'm in situations where I'm being asked to do something, I just remind people, because I'm like, there's a whole document, like these are my values. And and to your point, like I cannot do this. And there are also, sadly, lots of other people who will do it. And I think but it was important for me in my own kind of learning to be around people who modeled that for me. And again, like I am not perfect, right? Because I have done that. Like was like, oh, well, I don't think that we can do it, but let's try. And it, I learned the lesson that I needed to learn. And so you're absolutely right. It is a conversation that I think like, people have really wrestled with, like, what does this mean for the larger restorative justice community?
Yeah. Yeah. Difficult question in a different way. You get to sit in a circle with 4 people, dead or alive. Who are they? And what is the one question you ask the circle?
Yeah, so I know you're going to ask this, so I'm going to cheat if I may. So I lost my parents 20 years ago. So I would sit in circle with them. I have a brother, and so I could not sit in circle with my parents and not have my brother there. And we both have one daughter, and so I could not leave one out. And so there'd be 5 of us. And I think selfishly, I would want to know, like, if he and I are operating in a way that makes them proud, because that is very important to us. But I also recognize that that's a selfish question. So I think what I would do instead is I would just play games and activities, because like our children have never had the would of meeting them. And, while I do want my niece and my daughter to also be proud of us, I think would be more important for them to be able to actually have time with their grandparents who would have poured so much love into them, and just allowing them to laugh and have fun.
Yeah. Shout out to the family, shout out to grandparents, shout out to games, because play is such an underrated part of doing all of this work. Do you have a piece? We've dropped like lots of different gems over the course of our conversation, but for folks who are like facilitating either the learning of this work or facilitating processes, is there a practical like application tip that you have on the tip of your tongue that's important for folks to know or be reminded of?
Like facilitating processes like circles, or just like implementation in general?
Either.
I don't know how practical it is, but I think making sure that you are also taking the time that you need. Like holding a space is really difficult. I think if you're holding spaces in terms of like circle spaces, or if you're holding the work and helping other people do the work. And so making sure that you as an individual also have spaces where you are held. I think it's one of the other mistakes that I have made, that I actually continue to make. I'm saying this, and I'm also admitting that it's very hard for me to live this, because it is hard and tiring to hold everything for everyone else and then not have a space where you can pour into. And so making sure that you are taking care of yourself. And I know that that's kind of like a buzzword these days, but I think in this work in particular, those spaces are necessary.
100%. Last two questions. Who's the one person that should have on the podcast? And you have to help me get them on.
So the second part of that will be difficult. I think Rita Richardson Alfred is definitely someone who is amazing, and she hates stuff like this. But she
said no multiple times. Yeah.
So, I mean, we talked a lot about like administrators today. There is an administrator. She also like hates things like this, but I could actually help her. She's now working in central office, but her name is Laurel Porter, and she is one of the best. Someone who really believed in it and then, saw things through. And I think if part of the audience is other administrators, she's someone I continue to use to talk to other administrators. And what I've also heard from staff members is that listening to her had also helped them have conversations with their administrators, because they saw what was possible, what an administrator actually could do, and they were able to advocate for those things in their spaces too.
Yeah, absolutely. So looking forward to that introductory email. Yep. And like, if you want to text Rita and be like, yo, like you should really, I would appreciate that as well. And finally, how can people support you in your work, however you want to define that, in the ways that you want to be supported?
Yeah, we have a website, rjpartnership.org. We have a lot of free resources on the website. And so it's really our way of supporting other people. We're also developing resources all the time. And so if people have ideas about things, we have some things that never made it to our website that we have. But also, if there's a chance that you need it, there's a chance that someone else needs it too. And so if people have ideas about things that they would like to see developed, also letting us know. And all of our contact information is on the website as well, so people can feel free to reach out.
Beautiful. Well, we'll make sure the link to that, rjpartnership.org, is in the show notes for folks to check out. But Dwanna, thank you for finally making the time to have this conversation. There's going to be a more fun conversation that's going to go on in just a couple seconds, but y'all don't get to hear that. We'll be back with another episode of This Restorative Justice Life next week with someone who is actively building, strengthening, repairing relationships in their professional and personal lives. So until then, take care. Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. Or if you're old school, tell a friend. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, signing up for a community gathering, workshop, or course. So many options. Links to everything in the show notes or on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.